I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumray here again for JOBLO.com with another Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the 1988 comedy Midnight Run, starring Robert De Niro as a tough guy bounty hunter who has a routine job turn into a nightmare when his wily Mark, played by Charles Grodin, who's an accountant that's stolen $15 million from the Chicago mob headed by Dennis Farina, turns his life upside down. This one's directed by Martin Brest, who also famously directed Beverly Hills Cop and Scent of a Woman, but then kind of ended his career with the notorious flop Gigli, a movie that Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez are still trying to forget years later.
The genius of it, the absolute poetry of it, is that aside from the obvious wound, one's opponent is left with no memory of anything he has ever seen.
Modern audiences are kind of used to seeing Robert De Niro show up in big, broad comedies, with him having famously done the Analyze This series, and at a particular low mark, The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, as well as a whole bunch of Meet the Parents, Meet the Fockers movies. Too many Focking movies that, they make you all sick by this point. But back in the 80s, De Niro was notoriously choosy. He often flirted with comedy, and in fact was initially cast as the lead in Big, which is something that's hard to fathom these days, but he typically backed out at the 11th hour in favor of dramatic work, which was where his real niche is. Yet, in 1988, Martin Brest was able to entice him to star in the action comedy Midnight Run. And indeed, it opened to rave reviews. Universal was so sure that this movie was going to be a massive hit, they wound up committing a $15 million marketing budget to the film, which was a pretty big deal in 1988, and everybody really thought this was going to be a big, broad hit. The film, sure enough, ended up being something of a modest success, grossing $38 million in North America, but this really barely covered the $35 million budget, with it breaking even thanks to worldwide grosses and home video. Eventually, it turned into enough of a moneymaker that there's been talk on and off about doing a sequel, but for the most part, I would say this remains an unfairly obscure, somewhat underrated classic. For many of us who came of age in the 80s, Midnight Run was our first Robert De Niro movie, just like how, in many cases, Twins was our first exposure to Arnold Schwarzenegger. It used to be really unique when big-time dramatic stars or action actors took change of pace roles, although with the decline of the all-around movie star, most of them mixed it up more often in hopes of having more hit movies under their belts. So, while nowadays people might get more varied careers, totally unexpected outliers like Midnight Run just don't really exist anymore. And it's worth noting that the cross-country buddy comedy, a highly commercial choice in the 80s, would now likely be an indie or something along those lines, as it's less easily classifiable than studios are comfortable with nowadays. That's the beauty of Midnight Run. It's really funny, but it's not quite a comedy. It also has some good action, but it's not really an action film. I suppose the best thing to classify it as would be a light thriller, although Martin Brest, coming off of Beverly Hills Cop, isn't afraid to go dark when needed, such as a pretty intense scene when Dennis Farina's mobster tells the hapless Grodin that once he's done with him, he's going to go and calmly murder his wife.
I stopped by here to tell you two things. Number one is that you're going to die tonight. Number two, I'm going to go home, have a nice hot meal. I'm gonna find your wife, and I'm gonna kill her too.
Midnight Run probably wouldn't work as well if it were not for the chemistry between De Niro and Charles Grodin, who seem to genuinely be having a good time. De Niro often looks like Grodin's on the verge of cracking him up, while Grodin himself seems to be having a ball doing stunts and dipping his toe into action scenes. Robert De Niro sure enough really loved Charles Grodin, saying in a panel excerpted by the playlist that the way Charles Grodin is, it worked. His character was irritating, and Chuck knew how to do that, to work that. It felt like a good way to go. And indeed, the movie moves tremendously well as well, backed by one of Danny Elfman's all-time best scores, and peppered with outstanding supporting actors like Joe Pantoliano, that's right, Joey Pants.
This is an easy gig, it's a Midnight Run for Christ's sakes!
John Ashton from Beverly Hills Cop, and the scene-stealing Yaphet Kotto, in what seems to be a dry run for his long-term role on Homicide: Life on the Streets. Now, a movie like Midnight Run really lives or dies by its casting, and boy oh boy, were De Niro and Grodin just right for their parts. De Niro at the time had never really been as loose as he is here, and there's a bit of business in the movie, which is really great, where De Niro and Grodin are bonding and teasing each other about what farm animals they'd like to have sex with.
Did you ever have sex with an animal, Jack? Remember those chickens around the Indian reservation? There's some good-looking chickens there, Jack. You know, between us.
Yeah, a couple there might have taken a shot at.
Seems like something that was probably improvised in the moment. De Niro seems like he's about to crack up throughout the whole thing, but then also has a little moment of kind of self-realization where he kind of sees how his life has gone. And I think that it really nicely illustrates the growing on-screen and off-screen bond between the two. Now, apparently, Midnight Run was not actually an easy shoot. Martin Brest has always had a bit of a reputation as not necessarily the easiest guy to work with, and maybe a guy that gives himself over to his movies a little too much, which is why there were all kinds of stories about Gigli being re-edited and fights going on outside of the research screenings, and it typically takes him a really long time to make a movie, and often his first cuts are the ones that end up in theaters, and they end up just way, way, way too long. I mean, meet Joe Black, which has become an internet meme now thanks to the scene where Brad Pitt gets hit by a truck. Came in at over 3 hours for a romantic comedy. I mean, a 3-hour romantic comedy is just insane. Send to a Woman as well. It's a 3-hour movie, but the power of Pacino's performance in that movie kind of makes it work. Midnight Run was the last time that Martin Brest really did just kind of a lean and mean movie. I don't think that the Martin Brest who directed Beverly Hills Cop or Midnight Run is really around these days, but when he was at his best, he really was great, and he did these kinds of movies perfectly. But apparently, he took these films extremely seriously, with Yaphet Kotto giving an interview talking about how he really enjoyed working with De Niro and Grodin, but really did not care for Martin Brest, who he calls her director. In his own words, he said, "Her director shot so many takes of scenes that I lost all joy in doing the film. It became hard and tedious work. Then he stopped eating during the shoot and became thinner and thinner each day until he looked like a ghost behind the camera. When I met with Marty at Universal Studio with De Niro, he looked healthy and strong, but as filming went on, he began to turn into someone you see in Dachau. It was weird. I got sick, and for the whole film I had a fever and was under the weather for most of it. I was shocked when it came off so funny. It sure wasn't funny making it. And indeed, that's the beauty of a movie like Midnight Run. It looks like everybody's having a great time, but maybe they weren't. I think that De Niro and Grodin definitely had affection for each other, and I think that really comes across in the film, but apparently the shooting itself was a bit of a nightmare with complicated action scenes and a pretty big budget for the studio. Nevertheless, you can't really tell, and it's a really fun movie to watch, and I'm surprised looking back that it wasn't a bigger hit, because I remember seeing it quite a bit as a kid, although it seems like a movie that's kind of disappeared over the years. I'm not really sure why. I think when we look back at De Niro's filmography, we look at the movies he did with Scorsese, and we kind of tend to focus on those. Some of the other studio films that he did are kind of forgotten, and Midnight Run is really slick action filmmaking. In some ways, Midnight Run is a little bit like what it would be like if De Niro had played Axel Foley in Beverly Hills Cop, with him kind of smirking and having a good time and looking cool wearing a leather jacket. I really enjoy this film, and I think it's a movie that a lot of his fans would find pretty illuminating to watch, to see how fast and loose and fun he can be. Midnight Run was recently released on Blu-ray by Shout Factory, but is also available on most streaming sites, and it's on Netflix in HD, so you should give it a look. Now, I realize that a lot of you reading this have probably seen Midnight Run, so no doubt I'll get a lot of comments from people saying that they've seen it. However, I'm also willing to bet that this movie is kind of under the radar for our younger readers who are maybe just discovering De Niro. If you want to see him in his best in a totally entertaining thriller, check this one out. It's just a blast, and then also dig into the filmography of Charles Grodin. This guy was great. Until next time, I'm Chris Bumbray for JOBLO.com.
Don't say a word to me, Sidney. Don't say a fucking word to me. I'll get up and I'll bury this telephone in your head.